Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 407 for the 10th of Teves in irregular year. The 10th of Teves is a fast day in Judaism. It's a day in which we commemorate the sieging of the walls of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king of Babylonia in the year 588 BCE. And the reason why we commemorate this fast day is, such a big deal is because this sieging of the walls of Jerusalem was the beginning process that eventually led to the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem. So it's considered to be a relatively minor fast in Judaism, but many people observe it. So if you are observing this fast today, then I wish you an easy and meaningful fast. And so with that being said, getting into today's Tanya, so we're going to be talking about the self. The study of the self has been a huge topic in psychology throughout the years. There's been this fascination with the self. Freud, we know, really had very deep fascination with the self, and he divided the self into different categories. He said that the self is made up of the id, the ego, and the superego. Other more modern psychologists have talked about this idea of the dynamic self, how the self is constantly in flux and there actually is no static self. So most psychologists and philosophers have agreed that the self is not a simple matter at all. It's not like a simple thing. Nevertheless, in modern times especially, there's become this sort of worship of the self in popular culture. A great example of this is in the movie The Greatest Showman, which is a really popular movie, and it's a musical. And one of the most famous songs from this movie is This Is Me. And the song This Is Me is this sort of celebration of the oddities of the people. So it's sort of like everybody who's in the circus is a little bit strange and they're kind of different and a little bit of an outcast in society. And this song is sort of like this celebration of their eccentricities, of the fact that they're not ashamed of who they are and they're just going to celebrate who they are, and they're going to show the whole world who they are and just embrace it. And this is me, unapologetic and all of that. So while of course there's something very nice to this and there's something very appealing to it, but at the same time, people sometimes can take this idea a little bit too far and they can kind of misunderstand it. And we're going to try to get into a deeper sense of understanding this selfhood today in today's Tanya. So people sometimes can take this, let's say in terms of dating, and they can say that, let's say somebody has some really horrible character traits. You can think of what they could be yourself. They're really messy. They're really, let's say maybe they're very angry. They have a temper. Maybe they are severely overweight. They don't take care of their health at all. Maybe they are really just not very punctual. There's all kinds of different flaws that people can have. I definitely have lots of flaws. We all have flaws. And some people try to work on themselves and try to make themselves better, which is a healthy thing, versus other people might have the approach of, well, this is me, this is just who I am, and people just have to accept me, take it or leave it. So it's good to be aware of your flaws. It's good to be aware of what it is that you need to work on and to be honest about that. But it's another thing to embrace yourself and just accept yourself to such a full extent that you say that you actually don't need to work on yourself at all. But why is this? Because if your true self really is really beautiful and great, why do you need to work on yourself? Why do you need to change at all? Why can't we really be like in The Greatest Showman? This is me. Here I am with all my flaws. I'm just take it or leave it. Yes, I'm late. Yes, I'm messy. Just accept me as I am, and that's it. So in today's Tanya, we're going to come to a deeper understanding of all of this. And we're going to see that from the Tanya's perspective, the self is actually not one coherent entity. The self is actually divided into two parts. We've spoken about this already in the Tanya. We started to introduce this idea of the two souls, and how each one of the souls is oriented in a different place in the body and is made up of fundamentally different structures. The animal soul being made up of klipa and comes from Sitra Achra, versus the godly soul being an actual part of God himself. And today we're going to talk about the motivations of each one of these souls. And we'll see that the motivations of each soul is so entirely at odds with one another that the dynamic between them can literally be described as a war. But the interesting thing to note, and the biggest takeaway that I took from today's section, and you'll learn it together with me and you'll see what I'm talking about, is that when we talk about the motivations of each one of the souls, there's a lot of room, a lot of space that the Alter Rebbe gives to the motivation of the godly soul, and there's a lot of nuance and complexity that the Alter Rebbe describes in terms of what the motivation of the godly soul is, versus when it comes to the animal, as we'll see, the Alter Rebbe devotes literally like a sentence to it, which is really interesting. And even that one sentence kind of has a little caveat to it. So it's a little bit of a trick, as we'll see. And as we'll learn, as much as, yes, our self is divided into these two souls, the godly soul and the animal soul, and each one wants something very different. At the end of the day, as we'll learn, this is sort of like uncovering the wizard behind the curtain moment. Their core motivations are actually one and the same. And the animal soul actually, deep down, in a hidden way, wants us to resist it, wants us to not succumb to its temptations, and wants us to, in fact, go with the godly soul. So it's a trick or a test, we could say. Think of these two souls as sort of like teachers, where the godly soul is like the nice teacher who encourages us and nurtures us and, all of that, versus the animal soul challenges us and wants to bring out more within ourselves and isn't just satisfied with where we're at now. And the way that they challenge us is with different temptations, with different challenges, different tests throughout our lives. And we often see this through our lives, that it's specifically the tests, it's specifically the challenges that actually help us grow the most, which is kind of like the little secret of the whole Tanya, like the deeper understanding of the whole Tanya, that as much as the godly soul is indeed this very, very holy soul and everything, in fact, the animal soul has something over and above the godly soul that the godly soul doesn't have, which is this ability to bring out something new in us, bring out our potential in a way that the godly soul cannot. To illustrate this, the Alter Rebbe actually brings a metaphor that's brought down in the Zohar about a king who sends a prostitute out to tempt his son who's left the palace, and just for the sake of kind of bringing out the son's inner strength, to kind of prove that the son can resist the prostitute. So when the prostitute goes out to tempt the son, the prostitute doesn't actually want the son to give in to her temptations, even though she's going to do and act in all kinds of ways in order to try to get the son to get him to succumb to her. But deep down, she's actually hoping that he's going to resist her because she's in line with the king. She wants the king's desires, So it's the same thing down here with our animal souls. While it might really feel like our animal soul wants us to give into temptation, wants us to indulge, wants us to sin, at the end of the day, deep down, it doesn't. It actually wants us to resist its urges. And we sort of all feel this intuitively, right? This is why it actually feels really good when we actually do overcome an urge, when we do overcome a temptation. It's sort of like, yay, we passed the test and we actually became stronger. So that's sort of the idea of the godly soul and the animal soul. And let's see here how the Alter Rebbe explains all this. Again, as you'll see, he gives a lot more page room to discussing the godly soul and the godly soul's motivations. And I feel like this is intentional, because I think that really ultimately, even though, yes, we have this divided soul, these two souls inside of us, ultimately, our true desires are those of the godly soul, whether in a direct way from the godly soul or through the animal soul who actually wants us to resist it, really. But of course, that's not how our experience is felt. Our experience is felt that, and it's important to acknowledge that as well, that there are these two souls that are very real and that are motivated by very different things. So for context, we are still in the middle of chapter 9 of Likkutei Amarim, and we're actually going to be concluding chapter 9 today. And so the Alter Rebbe begins by bringing us back to an occurrence that we see in the story in the book of Bereshis in the Bible, where Rivka was pregnant, and she was pregnant with Yaakov and Esav. And as the story goes, she had a very unsettling pregnancy. Like there was constant movement within her womb, and the movement seemed to be really paradoxical. Like whenever she passed by a house of study or like a shul, a synagogue, then one part of her womb would start to get really excited and like make a lot of movement. And whenever she would pass by a place of idolatry, of idol worship, then another part of her stomach would get really excited. So what was going on? So Rivka, being a prophetess, she went to inquire of God and ask what was going on. And Hashem answered her. He said, Ule'um ye matz. He said, one nation shall prevail over the other nation. So basically what he was telling her is that she was bearing twins, that it wasn't a simple pregnancy. She actually had two kids inside of her. There were two sons. One was Yaakov and one was Esav. And this was a prophetic moment when she realized that these two sons, first of all, they were going to be very, very different from one another as they were. And they would both give birth to very big nations, and the nations would be at war with one another. So we know that this was true in a literal sense, that Rivka indeed gave birth to Yaakov and Esav, who were so miles apart from one another in terms of their moral leanings and spiritual standings and all that kind of stuff. And eventually they did turn into these big nations. But we can also understand this story as a metaphor, which is what how the Alter Rebbe is kind of coming to understand it, in the sense that the body can be thought of as a small city, an ir ktana, as it's described in Eicha, chapter 9, verse 14, and also in the Gemara in Nedarim, page 32b. So so just like there are actual nations in the world, our bodies in general, whether we're pregnant or not, can be thought of as being a small city. And just like when, let's say you have one small city, but yet there are two kings there. So who's going to rule, right? There's going to be a war because you can't have two kings ruling over one city. The city's too small for that. So each one's going to try to conquer the city. And let's say you had these two kings and they had very different philosophies, very different outlooks. Let's say one of them was like a right-wing Republican. The other one was a very left-leaning Democrat, almost to the point of socialism. They have very different philosophies. And so so they can't coexist. And so they're both going to fight for one another, and they can't stand the other one's rulership. So they're going to try to make it so that they are the sole ruler, not that they're a ruler and then the other person's like kind of a ruler. They need to be the sole ruler. So the analog for this is this idea of these two souls that we have within us. So we know that we have these two souls, as we described previously in the Tanya. We have the godly soul, and then we have the animal soul that comes from the klipos, and they're constantly at war with one another within the body and with all of the organs of the body. And so now, what are the wants? What are the desires of the souls? So as mentioned, the Alter Rebbe starts off and he talks about the godly soul, and the desires of the godly soul. So the desire of the godly soul is that it will be, first of all, the soul rulership over the body, as we described, and that all of the organs of the body will be partial to, or even more than that, nullified to its wishes, to the desires of the godly soul, and that the organs, the body, will actually become a chariot to the godly soul. Like a chariot is like, just its entire being is just there to really serve as like a vehicle for the godly soul's wishes. That's what the godly soul wants. And not only that, it wants that the body will serve as a garment for the 10 aspects of the godly soul, as well as for its 3 garments, as we spoke about above, right? So we spoke about previously that the 10 aspects of the godly soul are the 10 spheros, and the three garments of the godly soul are thought, speech, and action, but specifically in the context of Torah. So the wish of the godly soul is that the body will be a vehicle for all of these faculties. So it's like the entirety of the body will be infused just with these 10 holy spheros and these three, and will manifest in behavior in terms of the three holy garments. And that the entire body will be permeated just with these things, and that there will not be, God forbid, any stranger that passes through it at all. Meaning to say, what does this mean, like, on a practical level? This means that the three aspects of the mind, so there's this idea in Kabbalah, the mind, which is found within the head, is made up of three parts, will be filled with Chokhmah, Bina, and Das of the godly soul. What does this mean? So it will be the Chokhmah, the wisdom of Hashem, and the Bina of Hashem. So meaning to say that, like, all of the person's intellectual faculties and understanding and comprehension is going to be about trying to understand godliness, trying to really grasp the greatness of God, to the point that even though, yes, God is unfathomable and God is beyond our understanding, nevertheless, such a person would be like really just using their minds to the best of their ability to try as much as they can to try to understand God. And to the point that through so much comprehension and intellectualization about God, eventually that will lead to what's known as Das. So Das is that faculty. It's also a part of the brain, but it's where it becomes more emotional. Das is like the conduit. Das is like the intermediary between the minds and the emotions, where it becomes like that the knowledge isn't just theoretical anymore, but it actually becomes like real and personal. And this will lead to emotions like awe in the mind and fear in the heart. So it's an intellectually generated awe and fear in the heart. And not only awe and fear, but it's also going to lead to a feeling of love, like a very fiery and passionate love for God. So, and what will this love involve? This will involve this feeling of like that a person will want to totally expire within, have their soul expire within God, and to cleave to God to such a level that with the entirety of their heart and with their soul. This is what's known of the idea of Me'odecha, like that we say in the Shema prayer, that we love God with all of our might. It's like the entirety of our being. We want nothing but to not be separate from God. We just want to cleave to God and everything. And this is going to come from the depths of the heart that's found in the right ventricle of the heart. That it's just going to be like a person is going to be just so filled and consumed with love, that this love is going to trickle over from the right side of the heart, which is like its natural seat of the godly soul, and it's actually going to pour over into the left ventricle of the heart, which is, as we've learned, the left ventricle of the heart is the seat of the animal soul, but it's actually going to transform the animal soul, and it's going to transform any more physical, non-godly passions that a person might have into passions for God. So meaning to say, so as we described, the animal soul, it comes from Sitra Achra, right? And the seat, the source of unholy passions, the source of worldly passions, which are associated with klipas noga. These are sourced in the element of water, of the negative element of water, that's from the Sitra Achra. So what's going to happen is that these more worldly hedonistic passions that are kind of more innate in this person due to the overpowering nature of the godly soul, these passions will then become transformed into passions for God. And this explains, says the Alter Rebbe, that which we say, b'chol levavcha, we say this again in the Shema prayer, we say b'chol levavcha, with all of your heart, but the word with all of your heart here, instead of, it could have easily said b'chol libcha. That would be sort of like the more grammatically correct way to say with all of your heart, but it says levavcha with two besim. Why? Because it's with both of your hearts, meaning to say that it's the right ventricle of the heart, which is the godly soul, and the left ventricle of the heart, which is your animal soul. So it's like, this is an allusion to this idea that when the godly soul really prevails to such an extent, it actually pours over to the point that now you're serving God not just with your godly soul, but actually with your animal soul also. We've brought the animal soul over to our side of goodness, to the side of godliness. And This is going to lead to a person reaching this level of what's known as avaraba, which is a very high level of abundant love, which we're going to talk about further in the Tanya, more what that means, and a love that is even greater. That this is a type of love that's even greater than a powerful love, which is called ava azah kirishve esh, that's likened to fiery flame. So it's not just even a passionate love; it's what's called avaraba. A great love, and it's also called avabata nogim, a love of delights. So again, we're going to talk about this more further in the Tanya, but in brief, the idea is that it's where we think of God as a delight. We think of it like, usually we associate delights with like, physical pleasures, like a dessert or something like that. But here it's like God is actually the delight, that we actually get a sense of olam haba. We get a sense of the future to come when we're actually going to be delighting in godliness. So a person on such a level would actually get this experience now, even here now. And this experience of pleasure, this experience of oneg, it's called in Hebrew, is found in the mind, in the chokhmah specifically, and in the intellect. So it's like it's an intellectual type of delight, type of pleasure that a person is going to be experiencing, where they're actually going to be like understanding godliness in their mind. So it's like sort of like if you've ever had an experience of like having an intellectual type of pleasure where you really understand the concept and it's like, oh wow, like that's so cool, that's so like mind blowing or whatever. It's kind of going to be like that, but to a much, much higher degree, because we're talking about godliness here. And this aspect, because pleasure is associated with water, this type of pleasure is also associated with water, and it's associated with a seed, because water grows plants, seeds. And so what we're doing is we're actually causing the divine soul to grow and to change, to transform, as we mentioned, the aspect of water that's found in the animal soul, which is where all the pleasures of this physical world came from, as we described. And the Alter Rebbe says that this is actually written about in the Eitz Chaim, in the 3rd chapter of the 50th gate, in the name of the Zohar, that the evil will be transformed into total good, like it will be like a Yetzer Tov, really. So it's like we have, the good inclination and the negative inclination. So now the negative inclination, the Yetzer Hara, will actually be like the good inclination. So it's really going to be this full transformation where it's stripped off of its unclean clothes. It's called Habgadim Atzoim, which is what is the Habgadim Tzoim, the unclean clothes. This is the pleasures of this world that it's garbed within, right? So it's like the animal soul, as we've spoken about, is wearing these like dirty clothing, which is like the clothing of this world and the passions for this world. So we've now taken off these clothing, and now it's wearing clothes of the godly soul. So now they've become one and the same, really. And this is true not only of love and fear of God, which now this love and fear, we said, like, rather than having it be directed towards physical pleasures, physical loves and physical fears, but it's all directed towards God, this is going to actually seep and permeate into all of a person's emotions, because all of the emotions that are found in the heart, all of the aspects that are found within the heart are all just branches from love and fear. Everything at its core, all emotions can actually be traced back to love and fear. And so now, because we've transformed the love and fear to be love and fear of God alone, so too will now all of a person's emotions be directed towards God alone. And not only is this true in terms of so we've gone through the mind, right? So so such a person who's ruled by their godly soul, and this is this is the will and desire of the godly soul, and the motivation of the godly soul is that a person's mind is going to be used and only used and directed towards trying to understand godliness. That will be its sole purpose, and that will lead to a person's emotions to first through love and fear, and then all the other emotions to be directed only towards God. And then the next thing that will happen as a result of all of this is that a person's garments, remember they have the 3 soul garments, are all of those 3 garments will also be used only for godliness. So, for example, speech. So speech is one of the garments, and thought is another one of the garments. They will only be filled with the godly garments of speech and thought. So, meaning to say that what will a person be thinking about? A person will be thinking about God and thinking about God's Torah, and this is what he's going to be talking about all the time. There's a saying for this that's from the Gemara in Bava Metzia, page 86a. Lo fasik pumia megilsa. So his mouth never ceases from studying. So it's like that person that's just always talking about Torah all day long. That's all they talk about. That's what's going to happen to the person's garment of speech. And not only that, so we spoke about the garment of thought, we spoke about the garment of speech, and now the garment of action. So every single action that a person does and all the 248 organs of their body will only be involved in the action of the mitzvahs, which is the third garment of the godly soul. So that is the desire, that's the motivation of the godly soul, that all of the body's faculties, all of its attributes, all of its, whether intellectual attributes, emotional attributes, or its garments and behavior will all be used only and solely for God. Okay, so now what about the animal soul? The animal soul, so the animal, and this is where I said it's very short. So the animal soul comes from the klipa. So the desire of the animal soul is for the total opposite. That's all the Alter Rebbe says. So he says, it's just what is the desire of the animal soul is the opposite of everything we described above. And he doesn't elaborate on all this. But the last thing he does say, and this is how the Alter Rebbe concludes, and it's a very deep point, even though it's very short here, is he says that this is for the good of man. So it's not just like a mean thing that Hashem gave us this animal soul to be at war and make life difficult for us. It's actually for our good, because God wants us to overcome the animal soul and to win over it. And it's like the analogy of the prostitute that's brought in the Zohar. So I explained that in the beginning, and that's found, if for context, that's in the second part of the Zohar on page 163a. Again, the story of a king who wants to test the strength, the moral strength of his son. So what he does is he sends a prostitute to try to seduce the son. And he really wants the prostitute to try. He wants the prostitute to really, do her job properly. But at the same time, he wants the son to overcome the prostitute and not to give in. And the prostitute actually wants this as well. It doesn't actually want the son to succumb because she was hired by the king. So to here, our animal soul, even though it does on the one hand have these different temptations, at the end of the day, deep down, it actually wants us to resist those temptations. So that's it. So this is the basic idea. The human nature in brief is just this idea of this is why we have these different inclinations. This is why we have these different poles. Sometimes we want to do good. Sometimes we want to do bad. Ultimately, we only want to do good. And the times that we want to indulge, the times that we feel tempted, that we have urges or whatever they are that are not necessarily totally godly, they're actually only put there in order for us to overcome them. It's not the ultimate desire of the animal soul for us to fall into those, but it actually wants us to overcome these urges, and it's really the godly soul that's our deepest, truest self. So that's it for today, and tomorrow we will continue and we'll move on to a new chapter 10, and I'll speak to you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.